following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. As Nanaimo maps out potential big builds over the next few years, it faces rising construction costs. A South End community centre, upgrades to the public works yard, and a new RCMP detachment are all under consideration. At the same time, the cost of construction nationwide has risen more sharply than inflation since 2017, per Statistics Canada. One source we'll hear from today said costs are rising as much as 1% to 2% a month. Today on the show, we're going to explore the phenomenon and how it impacts the city's plans.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. My name's Bill Sims. I'm the General Manager of Engineering and Public Works for the City of Nanaimo. And that role is responsible and accountable for somewhere around 170 staff and about a $60 to $70 million annual capital program of projects throughout our community.
Well, thank you very much for making some time to speak with me. Can you give me a sense of what kind of cost escalation the city of Nanaimo has to deal with when it looks to get things built?
Right. And so, absolutely. So it's been shocking. I would say cost escalation in the construction and operations, the municipal operations side of things has been shocking. We see it all over the place. It's a North American or certainly Canadian phenomenon that construction has escalated to a really large degree. This seemed to be exacerbated by COVID. I mean, we're prior to that, say, up to 2016, 17, 18, we typically allowed for 2 to 3% a year in escalation of construction costs. And then COVID hit and senior governments started dumping money in to make sure that the economy was stimulated because everyone thought that the economy was going to tank. Well, with all of this money in, there was sort of this mad rush of spending and so on and so forth. And that seemed to that'd be one of the factors, I think, that drove costs. It was an opportunity for profit taking. There was, the widely publicized and widely talked about supply chain disruptions. A computer chip factory goes down in China, and then all of a sudden, vehicles are way more expensive and other things are more expensive. So it was this sort of weird disruptions to the entire supply chain as a result of COVID. And the laying off of thousands and thousands of people, and then, in certain industries, but not in others, and demand for labor sort of shot through the roof and wages went up and so on. So there's been this sort of really wild witch's brew of factors that have driven costs.
Is there maybe a specific example you can bring of maybe something that you were working on where you for the first time said, what? How?
Yeah, I think... traditionally, let's say we had, when we create basic budgets for a simple water main on a simple street, we would sort of be budgeting in the order of $400 to $500 a linear meter. That's just a rough number to say we're going to put an 8-inch diameter water main down a street and a couple of hydrants and some services, and we'll have to backfill the trench and put some asphalt on top. $400 or $500 a meter. That was pre-COVID. Then we saw doubling of that price from one year to the next, from 21 to 22, and then a doubling again from 22 to 23. So we were flabbergasted to say, how is this possible that the price of water main has doubled and doubled again? Because it's just not conceivable to how those. So when we saw this sort of massive inflation or this massive escalation in costs, it creates quite a bit of concern for us because suddenly now we can, we're trying to keep the budgets consistent, but we're now doing less meters of water main or less meters of roadway or less meters of sidewalk as a result.
So a linear meter of water main went from $500 circa 2021 to $2,000 circa today?
Almost, yeah. $1,500 to $2,000 a linear meter. And again, that's rough numbers, and there's lots of factors, but that's the kind of order of magnitude we were seeing. Now, that's not universally applicable. I think we also track, because we think you can't just double your budgets on everything or do half the projects, but that's kind of the net effect in the end. But we track a number of indices across the construction industry, and we did see certainly 10 to 15% inflation per year in general in the construction industry. So over the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen a 30 to 40% bump in overall costs. Now that's, I gave a specific example of water mains sort of doubling and doubling again, but the overall industry's seen that sort of jump in 40%.
So people will read about in the headlines maybe some of the big capital projects that are on the way in Nanaimo, something like the South End Community Centre or upgrades to the Public Works Yard. How does this phenomenon, how has that impacted the planning of those?
Well, it creates a lot of angst and I don't want to sound cavalier when I say the price is the price. We have to build these projects. These projects are necessary for the community to thrive. It's not to say that we should just spend the money because that's what it costs. I'm not saying that at all. But when these large projects come along, we need to carry on and do them, and we also can anticipate that over the next little while things are stabilizing, prices are stabilizing, and then the whole economic system will settle down and become a little more normalized.
When you're looking to go and have someone either do a big capital project, like do the work on the Public Works Yard or build the South End Community Centre, or even for something like water main upgrades, how many people are there that you can go to and get to do that work?
That's a good question. There's, as you mentioned, we often rely on the construction industry or large scale contractors to do this work, and some of them are specialty. We'll see some of the massive infrastructure projects, like the province just announced an 8-lane Massey tunnel replacement. Then that's $4 billion worth of, and there's probably 2 or 3 contractors worldwide that can sort of swoop in and do that or are interested in doing that. We have a larger pool, but again, depending on the scale of our project, like a $90 million public works building, we would have a number of constructors on the island or in the lower mainland that may be interested in that. So we would expect to receive anywhere from 3 to 6 interested parties to bid on that work.
Are there maybe any elements of this that you always wish you could share with the public when you're, I don't know, maybe reading through social media or even reading through just some of the news stories?
I'll be really honest. I steer away from social media because I'm finding more and more that it's less and less valuable. But certainly there's this sense of public projects are always over budget. And while there's certainly some stark examples of that, I think of the wastewater treatment plant on the North Shore that Metro Van is struggling with at the moment. The truth is that year in and year out, we build anywhere from 100, let's just round it off at 100 projects, and then we might have a few of them go over budget. And oftentimes our pricing is such that we have a few go over budget and a few go under budget, and we're generally year over year 5 to 6% under our annual budget, our annual project budget. So it's the headlines that grab people's attention, but the reality is things are running pretty well. And I think people have this sort of toilet seats for the Air Force costs $1,800 kind of thing. And that's not necessarily the case. The industry is is stable. It's pricing labor and materials in, and so the materials and the labor that municipalities buy, local governments and even provincial governments buy are a lot different than the consumer price index. Often we hear the complaint that our taxes should be no more than consumer price index, but that's a different basket of goods than municipalities buy. Consumer price index is a liter of gas and a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk and a whole bunch of other little things. Municipalities buy steel pipe, concrete, gravel, PVC pipe, and all kinds of other materials that drive our costs. So it's easy to be an armchair quarterback and say, well, the city should do, or it should only cost, or this is too much, or our taxes are too high. But when you're in it, and when you sort of see the complexity of the work that we do, the crazy wide range of services that municipalities provide, it's a lot more complex than, the city should just do this.
And I guess that's sort of the premise of our conversation today. Even just nationwide data from Stats Canada suggests since 2017, or something that would have cost $100 in 2017, something I should say, a construction project that would have cost $100 in 2017 would now cost $170 something, whereas the Bank of Canada's inflation calculator says $100 in 2017, this is getting really long-winded, is worth about $125 today. So basically the price of construction has gone up significantly more than just inflation. That's something that's backed up by our experience in Nanaimo. Do those numbers sound remotely right?
Well, I think that's really insightful and a way to go on you to sort of dig into that and ask those questions, because yes, you've just illustrated the point beautifully. Consumer price has gone up 25%. There's inflation, but the cost of construction, similar to the cost of running a municipality, has gone up. What did you say, 70% or so?
Yes, and I should say that's for residential construction. It was still higher than inflation. I think it was 140 nationwide on just all kinds of construction, or non-residential construction.
And here on the island, it's a little more complex and perhaps more impactful. We're dealing with perhaps a higher cost of living than the nationwide average would be, which drives wages, which drives construction costs. We have a little higher cost to get material and goods here to the island, so that also drives construction costs. And so I think 70% versus 25% increases over that time period works nationally, and is it may be even more than that here in Nanaimo.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about it.
Oh, this has been great, Joe. I appreciate the opportunity.
Bill Sims is the General Manager of Engineering and Public Works with the City of Nanaimo.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Today on the program, we're talking cost escalation in public construction. Rory Kumala is CEO of the Vancouver Island Construction Association. Data from Statistics Canada shows that building costs have been going up far more than inflation since 2017 across the country. Does that sound accurate to what you've been seeing on Vancouver Island?
It does, and I think we've seen that increased costs continue to rise, although it has stabilized in the last few years following the COVID era. So we do know that they're going up, and they really haven't settled in any market.
Can you give me a sense of why maybe those costs have risen?
Well, I think, the COVID, we're still kind of having a memory, a bit of a hangover from the COVID era where, there was supply chain constraints. There was, an increased demand for housing, particularly in BC. So clearly there's a market opportunity where construction projects needed to keep going, and they did. There was a high demand for materials. There was a high demand for labor. And now that we're out of COVID, and we'd like to think that prices are stabilized, particularly on the material front, there has been a tendency to see that the demand is still there. And really, when we're looking at Vancouver Island, Mid-Island, and Nanaimo area, there is a huge opportunity when it comes to construction. And there's only so many people that can do that construction, and materials. When demand goes up, costs go up because supply. I think people are taking the opportunity to charge more for their materials.
Yeah, can you give me a sense of, we talk about supply chain issues, or it feels like in the last few years we've talked about supply chain issues all of the time. What are some of those specific issues? Can you give me more detail on what that looks like?
Well, I think the supply chain issues really come, and this is only my perspective of kind of not getting into the details of, how much a load of lumber goes for. But when we're thinking about demand, we now have in BC and Canada a national housing crisis. So where regionally we could say more people are moving to Vancouver Island than they were from Vancouver, prices could stay fairly stable in a sense that there were different markets that were down, others were up. The problem we have now is everybody is up. Everybody has all of a sudden had this epiphany that we need more housing. And when we need more housing, it's just driving demand up right across the country. So that load of timber that's being produced on Vancouver Island is now being shipped nationally, if not, and we know it's going globally because the demand is so high. So it's drawing from resources and materials that we would otherwise use on Vancouver Island, whereas the demand side is suggesting that it's now a national demand versus a regional demand. So, this is, again, it goes back to construction costs or construction demand is low in one region and high in another. That keeps prices fairly stable. When everybody has the demand, it drives prices up.
So there's the resource side of things. There's also the labor side of things. Let's say I'm a local government in the Mid-Island and I'm looking to get a project built. How big is the pool of people who could realistically take a contract on from me and do it? Well,
we've sat fairly, in BC, we've had a fairly stable labor market, about 230,000 people working in construction in BC. On Vancouver Island, we can attribute maybe 25 to 30,000. And, that's an all-in number. When we haven't moved our labor number in 15 years. And in fact, we start to see a slight erosion, meaning we're not bringing in enough people to even keep the status quo. So we're also seeing that construction, the tempo of construction is all but doubled in most regions of Vancouver Island. So we're trying to do this, we're trying to do twice the work with an erosion of our workforce. So that's driving up that labor market pool, or that's driving more pressure on the labor market to do more projects. We were already having a tough time keeping up with what we were doing already. And this was 5 or 7 years ago before COVID. So we knew that the tempo of construction was high. The labor market is not growing with the demand. And we know that. Every contractor I know is looking for skilled people. So, that when you have a company that is where a company has a project and they're facing, all they can do to attract workers is, pay more, and the labor costs are going up, and and that's because of the demand. These companies, if they want workers, they have to pay more. And that is kind of what I think a reality that we have, which which kind of, we have capabilities, and I want to make sure we understand there's a difference between capabilities and capacity. We have the capability to pretty much build anything on the island. What we're stressed about now is the capacity. Far too much work out there, and we only have so much workforce to do it.
And I should remind listeners that this is all sort of hypothetical talk right now. There's not a specific circumstance that we're talking about here. Well, I'm also wondering about, like, if a project comes in over budget after it's, the bid has been taken on and there's a contractor and they do the work and then it costs much more than was expected. Is that a thing that happens, and how does it play out?
Happens all the time. I think we can go to any public project right now, and for the most part, I would argue it happens more often than not. We see large infrastructure projects. I'm in Victoria today, but I think of the Blue Bridge replacement. It was initially, if we had done this at the time when it was first presented, it would have cost $50-60 million, but it's come in, north of 150, I believe. So you can see how, there are projects out there that are coming so grossly over budget that, you kind of, I have to question what and how did they get that to that point, and what was the original scope. There's also an element of time. And time in this market is a killer as far as cost certainty concerned, where you have a project that can run 2 or 3 years. Budget planning on day one is much different than budget outcome at day, at the end of the third year. So that can put stresses, particularly where agencies, publics have an obligation to ensure that projects are done complete and properly and safely. And costs go up. And if projects last a very long time, those costs can tend to go up faster than or more than what was expected. We have a term called escalation, and that's often built into projects. And where we were looking at escalation of 1.5% to 2% a year, we see that at 1.5% to 2% a month. So that cost certainty over time is a challenge. But how projects go grossly over budget, some days I question the methodology, how they were managed. Changes are a big part of it. Changes in any part of a project they're costly, in a sense that you can't do things under a change at the same time you bid it for a year ago. Those change, and owners are sometimes, they're like, well, when you priced this a year ago, it was only this. Well, yeah, that was a year ago, and now it's a change, and I have to undo and redo some work so that we can have this. Oh, okay, let's just do that. Well, at the end of the day, you have cost. You
mentioned that cost escalation, maybe once upon a time in a distant past, was like 1% to 2% a year, but now is more like 1 or 2% a month.
Yep. Yeah, we're seeing some fairly, again, I wouldn't say I just think it's uncertainty. It's precarious. It's hard to, budget today and know where you're going to be at in a month or in 6 months. It could be a circumstance of how much work is going on out there. If all the contractors are busy, you're likely going to get a very high price. If contractors have capacity, you might get a better, more in-line price to your budget. So there's that aspect to it. And I think, where we see these, and there's regionality issues. There's, what's happening in the Nanaimo region with the housing market is just the same as it is in Victoria. It's the same in Vancouver. There's a huge demand. There's a lot of media. There's a lot of government announcements about new housing initiatives, and that's great. But you're not going to be building, we're not going to be building 50,000 doors a year on Vancouver Island with the current workforce we have. We just don't have enough. We can build, and we are doing a great job, but it takes time. And depending on when the project's going to happen and, where it is, that can increase costs.
And it's the workforce more than the raw materials that's the most limiting reagent here.
I think so. I think our biggest limitation right now is our workforce.
Is there anything else you think it's important for people to know if they're trying to contextualize how municipal construction works and why costs are so high right now?
Yeah, I think the context of high costs has to be offset against the value that infrastructure or that investment is. We know things are more expensive. We know things are costly. However, I think municipalities and our local governments have an obligation and a duty to make these projects happen. We need safe roads. We need infrastructure. We need a robust community with amenities. And those are investments that are costly now. Do their level best to, make sure costs are contained and, having clear scope and, expecting putting a good project team together. But at the end of the day, they've got to have these projects happening. It's going to be a tough pill, but it's got to be done. They've got to keep going with these projects. But maybe it's time. It's just, okay, let's not defer it, but let's open up the schedule a little longer. It takes a little longer, but we'll get it done.
Rory Kumala is CEO of the Vancouver Island Construction Association. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all from me for now. I'll be off for the next 2 weeks, but Midcoast Morning will still be here, hosted by Jack Corfield. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you can join Jack.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.